This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. I'm in Londinium. It's a fall evening by the Thames, and we will speak of the swans tonight because there is fresh swan meat in the markets, and the centurions, retired, were bragging about how only Londinium in all the empire has fresh swan meat. It takes weeks for it to go the high road to Rome, where the senators enjoy it. We can enjoy it routinely because they're in the Thames estuary. I personally don't recommend it if you're feeling delicate about the beauty of the swans, but it's said to be, I have a recipe, in fact, that the centurions gave me. If I have a chance, I'll give it out tonight. Germanicus is here. We're going to turn to something that isn't elegant like swans, even dead swans. We're going to turn to the story of political vengeance and how it's been practiced for 2,000 years. We Romans recognize it. Apparently, it's worthwhile for the American editorial pages to discover it fresh because of Emperor Trump. We begin tonight, however, reviewing the week that was. Chiefly, it was dominated by talk of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin redoubling their efforts to win their battle for Donbass, and the disappointment of the Trump administration. We're told that they weren't ready to come to the table to negotiate. We're told, and that the idea of the summit in Budapest is postponed, delayed, canceled. Choose one, who knows. However, there is the conversation of we'll talk about it, and that's engaging. At the same time, Mr. Zelensky was in Europe meeting with the Coalition of the Willing. That's the usual suspects in NATO, absent the U.S. this time. And Mr. Starmer, Sir Keir Starmer, was making lavish promises to Mr. Zelensky. Moving to other subjects, however, there's a fun topic this week. Mr. Trump has an architect who believes in the Greco-Roman casino style and is proposing putting a building up where there used to be in the East Room of the White House that is, I guess it's twice as large as the foot space of the rest of the White House complex. However, on Friday in Washington, the editorial appeared, unless it was Saturday, both days, from the Washington Post endorsing the building that can seat 999, we're told, in the drawings, saying it's embarrassing for a country to have to put up tents on the South Lawn every time there's a larger dinner than 200 or 300. So Mr. Trump will have his Greco-Roman Las Vegas building in the eventuality that some court doesn't step in and put a temporary restraining order on it. However, there's other news, so we need to attend to that immediately. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. The other news is the Ukraine front, in which there have been advances to the point of encirclements. Explain, please, and then we'll discuss siege tactics and how we Romans do it. Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. The Russians have very adroitly decided on a strategy that will keep the lid on a war and prevent some kind of hysterical escalation on the part of NATO, and at the same time ensure ultimate collapse of the Ukrainian army. And that has been a battle of attrition, but they've been adroit not just in pursuing attrition, but taking the opportunity offered to them by Ukraine that has insisted, and it's been Mr. Zelensky, foremost among the cabal of his regime, that has insisted, much as Herr Hitler did, or is repeated to have done in the Eastern Front in World War II, which is to say, not 1 inch in retreat, fight to the end. And unfortunately, that has been Ukraine's strategy, and it has really essentially done them in, or is in the process of entering that final phase wherein the Ukrainian military will fall. and that was the pathway followed by Ukraine at Bakhmut, at Avdiivka, and other cities, and is now about to befall Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, and the total bag, as they say, of Ukrainian forces could be as much as 10,000. There's a number of very hollowed out battalions that have been essentially encircled, completely caught in the noose. And the term that is preferred by Russians is cauldron. And so there are these two cauldrons which have surrounded the cities of Pokrovsk and its sister city of Mirnograd, and then also Kupiansk. And the problem is twofold here, that attrition has reached a point where losing 10,000 soldiers, if indeed that is the outcome, will not only demoralize Ukraine further, and again send NATO into hysterics of sackcloth and ashes, but it also pushes the Ukrainian military closer and closer to the edge, because there are so few available bodies, and I use that term deliberately, to replace the losses. And the losses are terrible to a large degree, given the unwillingness of Ukraine to pull back from positions that it refuses to give up. And this is a real problem in poor strategy in war. People don't want to give up a city which has symbolic significance because it represents a tremendous loss. But in fact, trading space for time is essential in any defense that wants to persevere and continue the fight, and do so with the utmost efficiency in order to prolong the struggle as much as possible. And that has not been the Ukrainian approach. And as a result, they are in deep trouble right now. But they're in trouble, again, from two angles, both from the actual losses they have sustained over the last 4 years from pursuing this strategy, but also they're at a point where the Russians can break through across the front.
Siege tactics. The ones that come to mind for we Romans, Carthage, especially the second one, the 146 BC, Corinth, Jerusalem, and Masada. You've got some as well. I just generally speak to those who study Roman history. Rome was very good at siege tactics, didn't like it. The centurions didn't like it. It took time. It was slow. You didn't eat well. You had to worry about water resources and discipline while you were waiting for the enemy either to starve to death or slay themselves or surrender. But they were very good at it, and they had first-rate artillery. And generally speaking, when a defense is thrown up as a fortress, similar to what you just described, many fortresses in Ukraine, that is the beginning of the end. They lose to Rome. And I'm presuming Russia is carrying on the Roman tradition. How do you measure?
It's similar, but different as well. It's similar in the sense that if you put enough resources into defending a place, then when the defense collapses, your losses have been so disproportionate, and you've lost many of your soldiers as prisoners of war, that the battle is a blow, and that blow is compounded by the fact, as I said, that this city has been made into a symbol of resistance and of ultimate victory because it won't be taken. But of course, the secret is superior forces always win a siege. Now, in Roman times, this process was similar, but it was compounded many times by the fact that this was an agricultural society with low levels or low rates of urbanization. So there would be in a war campaign, in a war, a fortified place that would be the nerve center of the entire nation or tribe, or the place that was the seat of government, or that had the treasury, that kept currency flowing, and finally that had um, the elite people who counted in that place. And that was the ancient world of Caesar and Vespasian and our own Emperor Domitian. And therefore, to take a capital city of a tribe or a larger nation would end the war. And as a result, like Ukraine, enormous resources were put into defending these places or developing places that were on top of great hills and were beautifully fortified in stone. And so a siege was not only a battle, and it would not only cause enemy attrition, but because it was so central to the life of that society, once the Romans took the city, that was it. It was the end of the war. And that was true in a number of great conflicts. You mentioned Carthage. Once Carthage fell, everything collapsed because Carthage was the not just the stronghold, but and the nerve center, but it was everything. It was the metropolis, the center of economic life. It was the center of wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And this was true also of the very long 7 to 8 year campaign that Caesar fought in Gaul. He conquered Gaul through a series of battles, yes, but ultimately the breaking point for Gallic resistance were sieges. One of the first was the city of Avaricum, which was the biggest and best fortified town of the Bituriges, one of the biggest nations. And he took that intensely fortified place by building a giant ramp over 100 feet high and hundreds of feet long. It had to be hundreds of feet long in order to have a slope that the Romans could push their huge siege towers up. And once those siege towers reached the summit of the artificial hill they had produced, the ramp, the town fell. And the Romans were able to do this in a single month. At the siege of Alesia, facing huge numbers of Gallic warriors that had been raised by the charisma or through the charisma of Vercingetorix, tried to come to the rescue of Vercingetorix and part of his army, which was holed up in an oppidum, a hilltop city fortress called Alesia. But in order to successfully take that, because there was a huge relieving army that was going to come and break that siege, Caesar had to build a gigantic set of fortifications, not only around and encircling the city of Alesia to keep it, bottled up, but also facing outward a second, even larger girdling of fortifications. And these were called in Latin the lines of circumvallation around the city, and the lines of what was it called? Contravallation, meaning facing outwards. And so the Romans had to fight a double siege battle that went on for quite some time against a gigantic relieving army, as well as a very large army that Vercingetorix had. And this was one of the great sieges of antiquity, and celebrated for the amazing organizational effort and engineering of focus that Caesar was able to apply. And there were more of these in the future. In our time, for example, facing the king of the Dacians. Let's see here, Decebalus. The Romans would focus not just on defeating Dacian armies, but taking the capital city, which was Sarmizegetusa. And that city was surrounded not just by its own walls, with its own water supply, its own great situation at the top of a mountain, but that city was surrounded by its own ring of fortresses, so that to get at the capital, the Romans had to reduce each one of these encircling fortresses. This is very similar to what the Germans had to do at the Siege of Paris in 1870-71. So that took an entire year. And the thing about sieges is that you have to be ready and able to fight a protracted war of attrition to wear down the fortifications, but more importantly, the defenders. You wear them down by killing them, but then ultimately they'll run out of food, and then sickness can break out. And the Romans, of course, unlike so many armies in antiquity, did not have to necessarily worry about their own forces getting sick because of the extraordinary design of their encampments and the incredible civil engineering that went into them to ensure that sickness would be kept at arm's length. So what the Romans did in all of these campaigns that culminated in a great dramatic climax of a siege was very similar to what the Russians have done. So at Bakhmut, which was celebrated as an impregnable fortress that would never fall, the Ukrainians poured tens of thousands of men into that siege, even though the Russians had tens to one, not just 10 to 1, but several times that of artillery and the capacity to just flatten the place, which they ultimately did. And it cost them a lot of casualties, many of them Russian prisoners who volunteered, get out of jail free, but not so free because they went into a storm of steel. But the Russians took it, and the Ukrainians lost disproportionate numbers of their army, and it really weakened them for the future. And then that was followed by Avdiivka, and it's now being followed by Kupiansk and Pokrovsk.
One detail about sieges, Roman style. Once the siege was broken and the Roman forces got inside the walls, they ransacked the place. There was no stopping them. That was their reward for the siege.
That's
and
tradition.
Even in Jerusalem, Titus, who was commanding the forces, his father had gone back to become emperor. Titus couldn't stop them, and they ransacked it, even the temple, stole everything. In fact, there was so much gold, the story goes, this is Josephus, that the price of gold went down. That's how much gold came out of Jerusalem. The price of slaves went down. That's how many slaves came out, because what then Titus did was give the order, destroy the city. So they slaughtered the men, and the women and children went into slavery. This is fall of the temple in the Great Revolt of 66 to 70. Masada came 3 years later and was a band of zealots. But the Russians will make that decision. The Roman way is to level the city, salt the fields, poison the wells, and sell the women and children into slavery. That's the Roman way. I don't know if that's the Russian way. I can't tell.
Well, I mean, the Russians are telling us very clearly, and they're taking great pains to tell us that is not the Russian way. In fact, just today in the big briefing on these cauldrons at Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, Gerasimov was careful to say that we always show mercy. And of course, the Russians have every reason to do so. One is that it really reinforces their propaganda message, because to them it's a just war, and they want to show that their cause is just and humane. And second of all, it's a very real motivation, in the sense that they're fighting fellow. I don't know. There's a deep kinship of two related peoples, and of course most Ukrainians speak Russian and have been in the Russian realm for as long as the U.S. has existed, for example. So it's a feeling that it's brother against brother, and of course the Ukrainian regime doesn't feel that way. They call the Russians orcs or Muscovites, but I think it's very different among regular people. So this is not that kind of Roman situation. In fact, Rome wasn't like that in its civil wars either. And you see, there is no, after Philippi, for example, there was no, cruelty shown. In fact, all of the soldiers were forgiven if they, swore an oath to Caesar, and they, et cetera, et cetera. And Caesar was angry that the Egyptians had Pompey beheaded. There's a different kind of code when it's, brother against brother or cousin against cousin. And so this is, I feel, a different kind of way moving ahead. Plus, the Russians really do want to signal to Ukrainians as a whole, not to the regime necessarily, which is obdurate, but to Ukrainians that, hey, we're not here for conquest and for breaking Ukraine. We want to end this. And so I think the Russians will make much of how well they treat the prisoners that they take.
The emperor is building on the grounds of the palace. When we come back, the controversy of the Greco-Roman casino style of the new White House. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. Germanicus and I are here. Germanicus, I did not know. We have a veteran of the siege of Jerusalem here, one of the centurions. He's not here today, but they told me that he'd be happy to tell stories about the sacking of the city afterwards because it made him rich. In fact, he's much admired because he was able to not spend his cash, but salt it away so he could retire. We'll tell stories in subsequent weeks. We're going to turn to building a gigantic addendum to the White House. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium. This is live. You're not ahead of us. We're not ahead of you. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're by the Thames. It's not chilly yet, but it's no longer warm like summer. The Thames is turbulent. There's fresh swan meat in the town. I mentioned it earlier. And some of the centurions who enjoy listening to Germanicus and I talk about this distant place called the 21st century, they said that their wives had indeed shopped today, and there was plenty of swan meat. I think it's very cheap. They must have had a big culling in the Thames estuary. We'll have swans here well into the 21st century. They'll probably be banned from the dinner table by then. And later on, if I remember, I have a swan recipe. For you in the 21st century who imagined eating a swan, these are mute swans. But we're going to address something that's equally lavish, which is the new building said to be going up at the White House. It is a surprise to no one that Jeff Bezos' paper, The Washington Post, endorsed the plans for the new 90,000 square feet, foot space of a building that looks very much like a Greco-Roman casino-style building that will seat 999, according to the Washington Post, at a state function. Washington Post said it's been an encumbrance and an embarrassment for years that whenever the White House wants to enjoy a festival or a ceremony or an inauguration, they have to put up tents on the South Lawn. I remind you all that every time a president has made changes at the White House for 240 years, there's been a large protest. Jefferson is associated with the colonnades, large protest. Wilson is associated with the porch that overlooks the South Lawn, large protest. Jackie Kennedy with the Rose Garden, large protest. So it's the way of the world that if you make changes at the White House, they will be objectionable to large numbers of people in the country. Then they quickly forget about it. This particular protest, though, might go on a while because it's a large addition, very large. Germanicus, I laugh because it's the Flavians who built the Colosseum. I don't think the Americans know this. The Colosseum wasn't built by Caesar. It wasn't even built by Augustus. It was built by, Nero had started the idea of turning wood into marble. And Crassus had burned down so much of the city, there was a lot to build. But it was Vespasian who started it and Titus who continued it. And Domitian has left it alone. And the symbol of Rome, the symbol of the Roman Empire, you will see on every image, 20th and 21st century of the Colosseum. That's a Flavian choice. Why? Because the Flavians weren't royal. They were business class. They were provincials. They were equus class. They had no claim to the throne whatsoever other than the year of 4 emperors, and Vespasian was pretty good at it. Now, Mr. Trump has no claim to royalty. He wasn't raised up to be president. He approaches matters pretty much that with the eye of a Manhattan developer or a casino developer in this case. So your opinion of the 90,000 square feet ballroom, Germanicus?
One of the most enduring legacies of the transformation of Rome from republic to principate, a kind of republican empire, was the opportunity given to each emperor to leave a memoriam, not just to himself, but also as a kind of gift to the city of Rome, the sacred city of Rome, the goddess Roma. And so every emperor, beginning with Augustus, added important elements to the cityscape of Rome. And it was said of the great god Augustus that he found Rome a city of brick and he left Rome a city of marble. And each of his successors in some way added to that a larger legacy. And it was expected of an emperor that he would increase the beauty and the authority of Rome with the buildings that he left. And of course, the Flavians offered up the Colosseum, but later on, Trajan would add a forum of his own, as Augustus did. Hadrian would create this massive temple, the temple to Venus in Rome. Baths would be a centerpiece of the effort of an emperor. And some of the baths, like the baths of Caracalla, were so beloved by later generations that the what should we call it? The remote progeny of Rome, that is to say, America, built one of the most glorious buildings of the Belle Epoque, or the later Gilded Age, this beautiful, in a Beaux-Arts tradition, a beautiful recreation of the baths of Caracalla, which was called Pennsylvania Station, and which Americans, in their venality and often their exquisite bad taste, decided to tear down in the 1960s. And that's been a lamentation ever since. And with official sites, the building program has always been massive. FDR was especially important. He built some of the great temples during his reign as emperor, like the Jefferson Memorial, the temple to the god Jefferson, or the Lincoln Memorial, the temple to the god Lincoln, and on and on. And the style of almost all of the official architecture in Washington is Greco-Roman, and it's really following that tradition. And Americans love this majestic imperial Greco-Roman architecture. And you mentioned Las Vegas. Las Vegas has very much of the Roman ethos coursing through it, where Rome would sometimes build things to excess, and they would have a mixture of grandeur and honky-tonk melded together and coexisting with each other. And I have a feeling that's what we will be seeing, but it's always the prerogative of the emperor to do this. And the emperor has the highest motivation to add something that will increase the grandeur of the imperial city. And there is no escaping this tradition, because this tradition, if anyone cemented it, that is to say, the institution of the president as an emperor, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And every president in his wake has sought this same sort of memorial. Even Eisenhower, who was more modest, left behind the interstate highway system. So you have this as part of the charge placed upon the emperor institution in America. It's not the way Robert Moses would decry when he talked about Nelson Rockefeller having an edifice complex. It's really more meaningful and significant as a part of our national life, and the buildings cement an association with every American as part of our identity. But as Americans, it would be false and dissembling to say, oh, this particular place, like the White House, is not to be touched. It is immaculate. That's not true. America is always building things and tearing things down, and that's part of the process. And if that's tragic, as it was in the case of Pennsylvania Station, there's so many other instances of additions that are valuable and beautiful.
In 1949, it might have been 50, at the White House, Truman and the family were there. Margaret, his daughter, and a friend were on the second floor at the piano, playing the piano. And suddenly, one of the legs of the piano broke through the ceiling into the room below.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, everybody went, "What's this?" And they looked behind the walls and saw that the building was in terrible shape and had been left there since the British burnt it in 1812. So they quickly did an assessment and realized the whole building was rotten. They put the burnt timbers back in.
Yeah.
The floors were falling apart. So the Trumans were moved out of the White House to the Blair House for 2 years. I think they got back in there before the end of the term. And they rebuilt the White House entirely. The original walls, the original rooms were turned into dust, were hauled away. And
right.
the steel frame. So the building only dates from 1952.
That's true.
And it's one of those, again, Germanicus, when facts replace the legend, print the legend.
That's
So,
right.
so the legend is Washington lived here, or Jefferson strode these corridors. No, no, and no. It's completely a 1950 reproduction of the original White House. And I read a story recently. I haven't checked it out.
Yeah.
It might be apocryphal. That the reason during the Bush administration, Pennsylvania Avenue in front was closed. I don't know if it is now, but it was closed for a while. I remember.
Oh, yeah, it still is. It still is. It does terrible things to traffic, by the way.
I read that one of the reasons is they realized a truck blast would take down the front of the White House.
Right, right.
Now, that may or may not be true, and they may or may not be able to reproduce it. But Trump is adding to a building that dates from 1952. That's it. We can debate his ambition all we want, but that's all. That's really what's happening, which might explain why the Washington Post didn't routinely, reflexively say no, no, and no. One more detail. Mr. Trump wants a moon landing before he leaves office. The details, he may or may not get it. But I think it's the same idea. He wants to leave something behind. He wants a legacy.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of connect the dots going on here, because Kennedy made this great call for landing on the moon before 1970, and that was symbolic of the larger vision of America as the pathfinder, blazing a trail into the future and leading the world. And for Mr. Trump, seeing the unraveling of American society that he has explicitly called out, and his cry to make America great again, this would be a symbolic token that he not only has he come through, but that America has been restored to greatness. And this idea of restoration is, I think, the best way to understand Mr. Trump's sense of mission and worldview. And it's one I think Americans embrace, even if they admit it or not. You know,
political revenge. We're going to add a little addendum today because it's witty for us in Rome to read of political revenge as a tactic by Mr. Trump being denounced by the editorialists. Good heavens. Good heavens. Have they read no history whatsoever? I'm Gaius. He's Germanicus. The centurions are nodding their heads about revenge. They understand it. That's why they're living here in Londinium. We're very far from the revenge cycle of Rome. But when we come back, democracy, republics, empires, all practice revenge. It's the nature of politics. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in our favorite wine bar by the Thames. The centurions are enjoying themselves, going home later to a meal of swans. In many instances, we've been selling swans today. This is a delicacy that I had not seen in our markets for some weeks. I don't know why. Perhaps the swan keepers were holding it back. Don't know. We'll investigate that later. And there's a new theater piece in town. And now you all know that I prefer Roman comedy. But the theater piece is a play by Seneca called Octavia. Maybe he wrote it, maybe one of his students wrote it. Let's say School of Seneca. You all remember Seneca's a philosopher who was murdered by Nero because Nero was a paranoid actor who was also the emperor and decided that Seneca was too smart to leave alive. Seneca wrote the goriest, the scariest, and so over the top, actually comical plays that Rome has. Octavia is the story of Nero's first wife, Octavia, whom he discards because he wants a new wife who is more useful to him as an actor. Octavia is the revenge play. Everybody dies. Everybody dies. Shakespeare liked Seneca's work. You know the story of the prince who is obliged to eat his children. I believe it's the Shakespearean play Titus. I believe it is, but I'm not sure. Well, that's Seneca. That's Roman gore. So we're going on to the theater later to see Octavia, which has been revived recently because it doesn't offend Domitian. He doesn't fear his wives. It is funny though. But first, revenge. Now, forcing a man to eat his children and then serving their heads, that's a little over the top. It's supposed to be. But revenge politics is the nature of the Roman Empire. And I believe it's the nature of the American Empire. Germanicus, has it struck you as odd that they're surprised that Mr. Trump is one by one taking vengeance on the men and women who concocted in the first term to beggar him and in the interregnum to put him in jail? Does that surprise you? Am I the only person who's not surprised?
I would only be surprised if the opposing party were to confess that they had done very similar things. And of course, you're never going to hear that. I mean, you're never going to hear about a Democrat president named Woodrow Wilson unleashing what are known as the Palmer raids, which it was on the morning of January 3rd, 1920. American law enforcement was unleashed to round up 4,000 citizens. And that is only equaled or topped by the fact that another Democrat president, Joseph Robinette Biden, did the same thing after the so-called insurrection of 2020. And it's a remarkable kind of activity, and the Democrats will never admit that they essentially went after Richard Nixon, whom they despise, and they found a way to defenestrate him.
And they were successful at it. They were good at it.
It was regicide, right? And but again, they had all of the commanding heights of the institutions at that time. They had not only Congress, but they had the Supreme Court. They had all of the media and the universities, and they were able to really drive this home. And so Mr. Trump, who managed to survive the same kind of effort that had been directed at Nixon with far less reason, although a lot of people even today question the entire case against Mr. Nixon. The fact is that they were out to get him, and they had kept in a kind of unlawful incarceration for people who had committed the smallest of misdemeanors, who were held in terrible high security prison conditions for years. I mean, that's just unspeakable. And so, naturally, there's going to be an effort to get back, a kind of vendetta, but hardly an unjustified one. In fact, Steve Bannon and others for the most trivial of offenses, not appearing before a grand jury, were put in prison for months. This is it's a remarkable forked tongue expression by Blue. So this always is the case, and recently, the more bitter politics has become, the greater the motivation, the greater the drive to get back at those who have wronged you, and it's unfortunate. In the past, we had this happen as far back as one of our celebrated founders, John Adams, who, with the Alien and Sedition Acts, tried to muzzle any kind of opposition, any criticism of the administration. That was done away with, and there was more amity in American politics, but there were still duels. Look at Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. There, how do we characterize that? And it really goes on, but it's crescendoed in a very worrisome, troubling way in the last decade, and it's not going, in all likelihood, to get any better.
I think what I observed, Germanicus, is the false piety, which is presented as a fate of the nation, existential crisis.
Yes.
Democracy dies in, what is it, twilight, darkness, some metaphor. The piety is laid on almost as if it's a melodrama. No, it's laid on as a melodrama.
Yeah.
With no sense of history, none. That if you don't do this, it'll get worse for you.
We live in a society whose knowledge, general knowledge of the world, knowledge of its own past, is so declined, decayed, and become desiccated, that the majority of Americans can be misled by this sort of talk. To compare, the January 6th riot as the greatest threat to America since the Civil War is beyond belief, and yet it was done not only with a straight face, but in congressional hearings with tears, with men breaking up, crying.
It was a star chamber of congressional hearings.
It was incredible to watch,
and it's good for them. Come on, Germanicus, good for them. They got away with it.
Oh yeah, but I mean, they can't then.
Yeah, they can.
Well, they can, of course. That's the whole point. Is that the lying has reached the levels that have never before been seen.
When they slam the door at one of their parties, don't you think they sit back and laugh?
I think they do. Because they have a dispensation, and this is true of all religious movements, and that's what I would call this, that believe that they are light and truth and the other side is evil. That entails a process of othering, as I call it, of dehumanizing the other side, so that your lying becomes an act of virtue, because it isn't simply that you're lying for a good cause, but you're righteously punishing these subhumans that really shouldn't be in any position of power or equivalence at all. So you don't have to feel guilty that you're lying. Instead, you feel good about it.
What do we take from this is that things have improved over 2,000 years, because in our time,
yes,
vengeance means you wipe out the family, your own family, before they get you. No longer necessary. I don't think Mr. Trump would go that far. Do you, Germanicus? I don't think so.
No.
Although his son Eric is being mentioned as his successor. That's always a dangerous position.
Well, it is for Eric. But no, the thing about Mr. Trump, and this a gut feeling, is that he doesn't want to be remembered as a tyrant. And he isn't really going to be physically, I think, in a position to entertain a third term, unlike FDR.
They're going to play with it. They're going to have fun with it.
Of course they will. Of
It
course they will.
is a cupcake tyranny compared to our day. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. It's funny, folks. And we're going to go on to a Seneca play where the spurned wife takes revenge on the new wife, which is funny. I know there'll be lots of gore and people get horrified, but it's Rome. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. The centurions are going home to swan meat. I didn't get to that recipe. I'll do it next week.
Wait, was that the famous swan à l'orange episode?
No, it involves stuffing the swan and leaving the wings. Let me see if I can get it quickly, because I've been listening to you and didn't pull it up. Where did it go? I was chatting with Ara earlier about it. It's somewhere here. I don't know. I didn't write it down. I'll remind me next week if people want a swan recipe. I know this probably horrifies the 21st century, but it was popular in our day. This is the Friends of History Debating Society live from Londinium, making everybody hungry for swan meat, maybe. I am John Batchelor, and thank you very much.